Our reading this morning comes from Tekina Nur Amin. This is going to have to wait. Doing the Loving Thing. This is the October 30th, 2024 Braver Wiser, a weekly offering from Unitarian Universalist Worship Web. They always open with a quote which begins, "The chance to love and be loved exists no matter where you are," from Oprah Winfrey. Dr. Amin writes, "I come from a multi-faith family. I inherited Christianity from my grandmother and Islam from my mother. In both of these traditions, which inform my practice of Unitarian Universalism, there was always talk about God's will and plan for your life. As the UU, I do believe in an idea of God, but if there's a will, I don't think it's like a record album and the needle drops when you're born. I don't believe in predestination that way. To me, if God has a plan for my life, it's that I choose to do things that are loving and generative. If there is such a thing as God's will, it's to always be asking, what is the most loving, life-affirming choice I can make in response to life's circumstances? And then to make that choice. Recently, I've been confronted with myriad changes, from health concerns to relationship shifts. Assessing and reasserting my boundaries has brought me grief, frustration, and sometimes despair. Doing the loving thing doesn't always feel good or bring instant gratification. There have been no parades in my honor for making difficult choices. My elders say, you've got to test the spirit. To me, that means examining our actions through a love lens. Does this decision hold up care, justice, equity, and compassion? Does it orient me toward joy and wholeness? If so, then it might be God. It might be love. Does it orient me to pain or shame? That's probably not God's will in action. This perspective also makes me think differently about power. The Christian nationalist version of power arising from white supremacy culture is a muscular power. It's militaristic. It's, I'm going to hurt you if you don't do it the way I think you should, as opposed to a power that invites, a power that whispers, a power that persuades, a power that says, what would love do? A little voice that tugs at you and asks, is there a more loving option? If we can embrace the power of love, of God's will and plan for us, as an invitation to love more fully and deeply, and to conceive of each other as worthy, I think we'd be a whole lot closer to living lives of wholeness and usefulness that reflect our deepest aspirations. Her prayer: God, help us to quiet the noisiness of life so that we can know you, persuading us to love in action. Give us the courage and fortitude to make loving, life-affirming choices in the face of death-dealing empires, quick fixes, and selfishness. Issues of social justice have always been at the heart of our faith as Unitarians, Universalists, and now as Unitarian Universalists. Given our almost 300-year history, few other denominations or faiths can claim social justice to be as integral to their identity as we can. Mind you, this hasn't always been because we were for progress or change or the betterment of humanity. Sometimes it has been because we have been deeply dead set against it. For as many of us who were against slavery, there were also a lot who were for it. For as many of us who were for women's rights, including for voting and education and ordination, there were also plenty against it, and in the case of ordination, many more against it. For as many of us have advocated for rights for those in the LGBTQIA+ and queer community, this has not always been our stance, and we still often fail this community. And some of us really shone during the civil rights movement, and I'm going to highlight 3 of us who did. Our small faith had 2 martyrs in that time, just 2 weeks apart in 1965. The first was the Reverend James Reeb. Ordained as a Presbyterian minister, he became a Unitarian in 1959 when he began as the assistant minister of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. In 1963, he moved to Boston to work for the American Friends Service Committee. He and his wife and 4 children moved into what has been called a slum neighborhood and enrolled their children in the local schools, which served mostly Black children. Reeb was horrified by the news and the TV coverage of police attacking demonstrators in Selma as they attempted to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, a day often remembered as Bloody Sunday. The next day, King put out a call asking clergy to join him in a second attempt at a Selma to Montgomery march the following day. Reeb learned of the request that morning and was on a flight that evening. That second attempt was symbolic, and Reeb chose to stay until the court would grant permission for a march, which was expected to come in 2 more days. That evening, after dining with 2 other Unitarian ministers, the trio was followed by a small group of white supremacists, and Reeb was struck on the head. White supremacists delayed his transportation to the hospital in Birmingham, where he could have had surgery. While he was en route to the hospital, King called a press conference and asked people to pray. Reeb, unfortunately, died 2 days later. Reeb was a 38-year-old white man when he was killed. His death provoked mourning across the country, with thousands of vigils in his memory. President Johnson called Reeb's widow and father to express his condolences, and just 4 days after his death, Johnson invoked Reeb's memory as he delivered a draft of the Voting Rights Act to Congress, the same day King eulogized Reeb in Brown's Chapel. It is too bold of a claim to say that Reeb was the reason for the Voting Rights Act, but it is not too bold of a claim to say that his death catalyzed its arrival and passage at that time. At that same time in Detroit, a stay-at-home mom of 5 and an active member of her local NAACP, Viola Liuzzo, too, was horrified by what was happening at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. After a protest the following week at Wayne State, where she was enrolled part-time as a student, she heard of King's call for more support from people of all faiths. She went home, packed her bag, kissed her children goodbye, telling her husband that this was everybody's fight, and drove to Selma. While she was a stay-at-home mom, Liuzzo wasn't June Cleaver and didn't have rose-colored glasses. She grew up in deep poverty and dropped out of school and eloped at 16. The marriage didn't last, and she returned to her family 2 days later. She married another man and had 2 children and divorced him in 1949. She married another man later, and they had 3 children. At that time, her decisions to divorce were remarkable. In protest of Michigan's law that allowed children to drop out of school, she removed her children from public schools and homeschooled them for 2 months. She was taken to court, where she pled guilty and was put on probation. Liuzzo grew up mostly in the South and was deeply familiar with both the segregation and racism there, as well as that of Detroit. All of her experiences led her to become an activist. She protested, got involved with the local chapter of the NAACP, and even organized protests around Detroit. When she arrived in Selma, Liuzzo connected with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who had her helping with various activities before she joined the 4-day walk to Montgomery from March 21st through 25th. After arriving in Montgomery, Liuzzo was shuttling other marchers back to their homes that night when a car with 4 Ku Klux Klan members first tried to run her off the road and later pulled up beside her, and one of them shot her in the head, killing her instantly. Her passenger, a 19-year-old black man, survived the car crash that followed her murder. Liuzzo holds the dubious distinction as the only white female protester to die in the civil rights movement. Her story was slandered at the time in a smear campaign run by the FBI and specifically J. Edgar Hoover. The Reverend Dr. Victor Carpenter recounted of this time in an interview for The Arc of the Universe is Long, published in 2007. We were really doing something. Suddenly, some people actually thought we were dangerous. Our phones were tapped. Moles were in our congregations. Very few ministers can complain about moles being in their congregations these days, but we were on the cusp. Whitney Young is another UU whose name gets mentioned regarding his role in the civil rights movement. He was not on the front lines in the way that Reeb and Liuzzo were, but did his part to help change things through policy and practices. In 1961, Young became the executive director of the National Urban League, and his tenure, which included then serving as president, continued until his unexpected death in 1971. Young had a rich legacy as a social worker. Having served in the Army in World War II and as a black man, he felt called to work on issues of race relations and channeled this interest through social work. In 1954, he was named the Dean of the Atlanta University of Social Work. Young and his family became members of the UU Congregation of Atlanta, and he challenged its members to confront at least some of their overt racism. Young became the co-chair of the Atlantic Council on Human Relations and played a major role in desegregating the public library system. Beyond his many accomplishments in the world, he also served Unitarian Universalism on the board of the Atlanta Congregation, as well as the board of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, 2 separate years, and on the UUA Commission on Religion and Race. No white faith, no white Christian denomination, and no white religious group in this country was deeply involved in the civil rights movement until 1968 and King's assassination, apart from Unitarian Universalists and Quakers. While other individuals of other denominations did respond to King's call to Selma and other events, none of them went in the name of their denomination. Whereas there was a national UU board meeting happening at the time of King's call to Selma, and they voted as a board to go. I share these various examples of the ways some of us participated in the civil rights movement to remind us of 2 things: that we are part of a legacy of love that goes farther back than these beloveds, and second, that there is no right way to participate in making change. We need to find a way that suits everyone. Deepa Iyer, in her book Social Change Now, considers 10 different roles we may take on at any given moment, which may change over the course of our lives and as movements shift and change, and we may certainly hold more than one. The 10 are leavers, experimenters, frontline responders, visionaries, builders, caregivers, disruptors, healers, storytellers, and guides. The slide is probably really difficult to read, but just bear with me. Frontline responders assemble and organize resources, networks, and messages. Visionaries imagine and generate possibilities, hopes, and dreams, and remind us of our direction. Builders develop, organize, and implement ideas, practices, people, and resources in service to a collective vision. Disruptors take uncomfortable and risky actions to shake up the status quo, raise awareness, and build power. Caregivers nurture and nourish people around us by creating and sustaining a community of care, joy, and connection. Experimenters innovate, pioneer, and invent. Weavers see the through lens of connectivity between people, places, organizations, ideas, and movements. Storytellers craft and share community stories, cultures, experiences, histories, and possibilities through art, music, media, and movement. Healers recognize and tend to the generational and current traumas caused by oppressive systems, institutions, policies, and practices. And guides teach, counsel, and advise using our gifts of well-earned discernment and wisdom. What I would like you to do now is form groups of 4, preferably with members and newer folks mixed in together. You should have an index card. I'd like you to talk amongst yourselves and discern which of these categories you might fit in and support others in thinking through this for themselves. I'd like you to then write on the card your name and which roles you think you identify with. Please put a star somewhere on the card if you're new or newer, please, so that I know how to follow up or not follow up with you. And you're welcome to write down anything else on the card that seems relevant to this exercise. Folks on Zoom, please use this time for reflection, and you're welcome to send me an email if you would like at lakecountyrev@gmail.com. I'm going to give you about 7 minutes from start to finish, so hopefully about a minute and a half each to talk. You may begin.
Kristina, can you repeat slowly the categories?
You're welcome. Okay, go ahead.
You know who I am.
So our folks on Zoom, if you would like to share a comment in the chat, everyone will be happy to share that with you as well.
Come on over, Greg. Come on down. It's okay. Yeah, we'll help you. Don't worry about it. Terry, this is Greg. Greg, Terry. We're usually in our group, so why don't we all just do this quick? Yeah, one. Here's one. I don't have one either. It's right there on the screen. Here's the button. Yeah. You. All right. So look at it first. I remember having Legacies. So we're supposed to write down. Was it for guy? Up here?
Every now and again.
Oh, no, Mark?
All right. I know the handout wasn't much better than the screen, but you did the best you could, and I'm grateful for it. I will be collecting the cards too as we exit the sanctuary. Thank you all for sharing. These cards may or may not be used in the future. I don't know. I don't have a plan, but I thought it would be good to know who's present among us and how we might gather when things get more difficult for ourselves and our neighbors, which would be like in a week. As a new and frightening administration takes office next Monday, may we take heart in the strength of our faith and our ancestors who are also called by injustice to act not just for their time but for the future. May we find ways we can co-create a more just, compassionate, generous, interdependent, equitable, transformative, and pluralistic world centered on liberating love as we are called to do by our values. As my colleague, the Reverend Dana Edwards, writes in Revolutionary Love, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for my faith. My faith that our collective love united can drown out the evils of empire and hate and greed. Together we can create a love energy more powerful than any force of oppression. Because when two or more are gathered side by side, arm in arm, shoulder to shoulder, the force of love ignites liberation. Revolutionary love calls us to know ourselves deeply. See the stranger, see God in the stranger, find beauty in the imperfect. Revolutionary love calls us to find the divine in dirt, the holy in the heartache, and the sacred in the scars. Revolutionary love calls us out and then back in. Revolutionary love calls us to be better and do better. Revolutionary love calls us to heal and hold each other, because none of us would be here if it weren't for our faith in each other. Our closing hymn is We'll Build a Land, and the words will be on the screens.
Terry?